The bees! The bees!
Too much? Blame Nic Cage. Hello, Champagne Nightmares. Welcome back to my channel. I'm your girl, Miss Jaye, the trash queen of glam, geek, and gore. And for today's horror video, I was in the mood to talk about The Wicker Man. So I was home watching some stuff on Shudder, just kind of going through the list, and they had added a new documentary. It's called Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, and it is a big documentary, 3 hours and 15 minutes, all about folk horror. And so I like folk horror. There's a lot of examples of folk horror that I'm really into. Recent examples that people are familiar with would be like Ari Aster's Midsommar. I love it. I think it's fun. I love going into the wild and seeing what kind of weird witchy cults they come up with and all that kind of stuff. So I decided to go back and look at a classic, The Wicker Man from 1973, as well as the campy, over-the-top remake with Nic Cage. If you're excited to talk about folk horror, as well as both versions of The Wicker Man, then stick around because we're getting into it right now. Alright, so let's start by talking about The Wicker Man from 1973. It is a British picture. It's set on this beautiful island in Scotland called Summerisle. And basically this police sergeant has been summoned to the island because of a missing girl named Rowan Morrison. That's important. So that's one of the first pieces of symbolism that we get in this film, is that the little girl's name is Rowan. So Rowan is a type of tree. And for those of you who are fans of Anne Rice's The Witching Hour, you know that Rowan is a tree that is associated with witchcraft and protection and things like that. Already we've got some spooky vibes going on, but this police sergeant shows up and he's going to investigate this little girl. This movie, what you need to know about the symbolism in this movie, it's not subtle. Everything is so on the nose, on the surface, it's really obvious. And this guy, Sergeant Howie, is there to be a representation of patriarchal power. He's a police officer, he's a white man, he's a Christian, and he is just there to come and mess with their tradition. So he gets there, and he realizes very quickly that this island is all these pagans who are doing these strange rituals that he doesn't understand, and he doesn't really approve of because of his strong Christian beliefs. And in addition to being an uptight Christian, he's also a virgin. So he mentions to one of the characters that he's engaged, but he doesn't believe in sex before marriage. These people believe in sex all the time. So he checks into this inn above the bar. So he gets a room above the bar. Immediately, the whole bar, all the patrons in the bar, sing this bawdy sexual song about the landlord's daughter. And they're clearly talking about the barman's daughter, Willow. So she's this voluptuous blonde, played by Britt Eklund. And she is very sexy, and she laughs and dances along with it. And he puts a stop to it. He raps on the bar and interrupts everything. And he's like, "You should know I'm here on official business." And he is such a straight white man. He runs around this village and is like, "You're gonna do this. You're gonna do this." Immediately, characters start telling him, "You should get that cleared with Lord Summerisle. You need to have approval from Lord Summerisle. You need to get permission from Lord Summerisle," because this is a private island. So the whole island is owned by Lord Summerisle, and he is sort of in charge, and everybody defers to him. Well, white man from the mainland does not like this. And he's just like, "I'll do whatever I want." And he's storming around and looking in cupboards and all this shit. He doesn't give a shit. Like a straight white man. It's so obvious. So everything on this island is about sex.
Let's talk about sex, baby.
Copyright strike. I don't know if we'll keep that one in, but... So there's the bawdy song about the barmaid's daughter, and then there are people just fucking in this park. So he goes out after dark, and there's just people having sex on the ground in this park for no reason. Just because it's after dark, they're ready to do it. And there's a whole bunch of them. It's like this weird orgy, but like there's no interaction between the couples. It's just like, this is the park where we go to fuck. It's weird, but go with it. So he is now upset and trying to figure out what's going on. And he goes to his room and he's praying. And they intersperse that with the barkeep's daughter. She's in the room next to his, naked, and she starts singing this sort of folky song, and she's knocking on his wall and trying to tempt him, and is like, you should come to me, we could get naked and do fun things. Like, it's all this kind of folksy, like, it's like what you would imagine for Woodstock. It's what pervs imagine Woodstock was like, where she's just naked, tits out, and just like, come have sex with me, weird man. And it's like, he's not even that cute. So then the next day, he goes outside and they have put up a maypole. I grew up with the maypole. Like, that tradition is apparently an old pagan tradition. But the idea of having this pole that you wrap with streamers and you do this whole dance, I remember doing that in Bow Bells, North Dakota, and we are not a pagan paradise, trust me. But, so they're doing it, and while they're doing it, they're singing this song about the life cycle. From the tree, there was a bird. From the bird, there was a feather. The feather became a bed. On the bed was a girl. On top of the girl was a man. And then the man was in the grave, and then they grew a tree on the grave. And so it's all about the life cycle, and it's all explicit references to sex. And that's one thing that just keeps him, like, excited, not excited in a dirty way, but just like, he's always like on edge. Because everybody's talking about sex. There's all these images of sex. I mean, the first place that he goes in town, there's just like images of the March hare everywhere. And we know rabbits like to fuck. And so it's just sex, 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 sex. And he's not having it. He's upset. And at first, everybody's like, we don't know that girl. We don't know who it is. He's got this picture of this girl that's been reported missing. He doesn't recognize her. Her mom doesn't recognize her. It's like, I don't know who that is. Like, all this kind of stuff. Well, then eventually he goes to the school. He walks into the school and they're doing a lesson about men, and it's all girls. So this school is all girls. They've got the girls and the boys separate for some reason. They never explain it. But that'll be important for the remake. And so it's all these little girls, and they're asking, what does the maypole represent? And one little girl, as the cop walks in, is like, the phallic symbol, it represents the penis. And he's just like, what are you teaching in these schools? I'm going to report you. And the teacher is like, I didn't think that you were in charge of education. He's like, I'm not, but I'm a straight white man, and you have to listen to me, and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, we need to find this girl. Does anybody recognize this girl? And everybody's like, no, we don't know that girl. And so then he is like, whose desk is that? He sees an empty desk. Whose desk is that? And they're all like, we don't fucking know, white man, you're not from here. And so then he just is like, I'm going to look at your record. And she's like, you're going to have to get permission from Lord Summerisle. And he's like, no, I don't, I'm a man, you can't stop me. So he just grabs it out of her drawer and looks, and there, Rowan Morrison is on the roll. And so then he's like, he just looks at the little girls. So all these little girls who are like, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years old. I can't tell children's ages. But he just looks at them and he's like, you're all dirty liars. It's so funny. It's so, he's like so intense. He's like, you're all dirty liars. And then the teacher starts to say something. He's like, and you're the biggest, dirtiest liar of them all. And it's like, settle down, Christian man. Like, it's fine. You're going to be okay. But she's like, I'll talk to you outside. And so they go outside. So the teacher takes him outside, and she's like, Rowan Morrison doesn't exist. And he's like, you're a liar. I found her in the record. Why are you covering this up? And she's like, you don't understand our ways. We don't use the word. And then she kind of whispers, she's like, dead. He's like, oh, so Rowan is dead. And she's like, well, she's returned to the source. So then she gives this like sort of neo-pagan-y kind of thing of like, you know, once somebody has finished their human life, they return back to the trees and the air and the wind. And we celebrate that. We think it's all part of the life cycle. We love it. It's great. It's fabulous. You don't understand us, so fuck off. And so basically she's saying the little girl is dead, and that's what you would call it, but we just say she's returned, and so she doesn't exist. So he decides to go and visit the graveyard, and the church is kind of falling down. It's kind of like not great. Like, it's not in great condition, but it's still there, and he's like walking around, and while he's in the graveyard, there's a woman just sitting on a grave breastfeeding a baby while holding an egg. And I'm like, okay, so clearly the sort of fertility pagan symbolism is not subtle. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know why she has to hold the egg while she breastfeeds. She already had the baby. So it was like weird. It's like anything that's ever been associated with witchcraft, let's just make it all happen at once. And so he sees this woman and he's shocked. And so he goes and he sees this grave, and there's like offerings of like fruit and shit in baskets. And he just smashes the baskets. He's in a graveyard. So this guy who's supposedly all Christian and all about Christianity doesn't care about desecrating a graveyard. So he smashes these things and then makes a cross out of the wood and like leaves it there. And it's like, simmer down, colonizer. So he's going on and he's questioning everybody, and everybody is giving him as little as possible. The big things that they tell him over and over is you should talk to Lord Summerisle, and you shouldn't be here for the May Day celebration. Everybody's trying to tell him, we don't think you'd like the May Day celebration. It's not for you. Maybe you should leave before the May Day celebration. They're trying to tell him, like, they're telegraphing out, like, some shit's gonna go down on May Day, which is, like, the next day. So he is running around and trying to figure out what's going on. And he goes to the chemist, which is, like, the drugstore. But he's also the photographer. And then the guy notices that one of the pictures is missing from the bar. So this is earlier, sorry. Not great with timelines. But earlier in the bar, he had seen these pictures of the, like, festival queen, the harvest festival queen, which is like a picture of a little girl with the vegetables and shit that they harvested. So the one from last year is missing. It's gone. And he said, oh, somebody broke the frame. And so then he's like, oh, what's going on? So then he finds out that the chemist is also the town photographer. So he's like, do you have copies? He's like, I don't keep copies. I'm loosey-goosey with all this shit. It's all a pagan wonderland. So he's still going around and he's talking to people and just getting more and more frustrated that nobody wants to just be as uptight and white as he is. Everybody else is loose and with their tits out and just ready to go. So finally he goes to see Lord Summerisle, who is glorious. It's Christopher Lee, and he's got a big bushy hairdo, and he's as campy and wonderful as you would expect. And he's sort of the Lord of the Isle, and he said, I found Rowan's grave at the churchyard and I want to exhume the body. And he's like, okay, that's probably fine. And then they keep talking. And then out of nowhere, he's like, you need to give me permission to open the grave. And he's like, I thought I already did. Which he did. If you were paying attention, he clearly said, oh, that's probably what you'll have to do then, is open the grave. And he's like, you have to give me permission. He's like, I already did. And they're like fighting about something that they weren't even fighting about. It's weird, but they're talking about the fact that this is a pagan island. And he gets really in his face about their beliefs and how they feel about their gods versus the Christian God. And the guy's all uptight. He's like, what about the one true God? What about Jesus? And he's like, well, he's dead. It's just like this whole back and forth. And you can see this cop just cannot believe that this world even exists. But he finally starts to listen because all of the discussion before has been with women. And so because he's this patriarchal man, we can't listen to these silly women. They don't know what they're talking about. Their ovaries are making them hysterical. So, but now that a man, another white man is explaining to him, he's like, oh, so you're just crazy, but I'll believe that this is what's happening. And so they've been talking about these like fertility rituals and harvest rituals and all this kind of stuff. So he's just mad. So he's going to dig up the grave. He does. I don't know why. So he's talking to him in the middle of the afternoon. He waits to dig up the grave until it's nighttime. All of a sudden it's pitch dark. It's like midnight dark outside. He digs up this grave and there's a dead March hare in it. So he takes the hare up to Lord Summerisle's estate and just like walks into their house. And then I think the school teacher is there and she's singing this like pagan song about fucking everybody or whatever it is. And he just throws the dead hare on her blanket. Rude. And just is like yelling at them and they're going back and forth. And they're like, if you don't like this, you shouldn't be here for the May Day celebration tomorrow. Everybody's telling him you don't want to be here for the May Day celebration. So then he goes and he breaks into the chemist shop and he finds the negative of the harvest picture from last year and he prints it up. I don't know. So apparently he just knows how to develop photos and just like knows where to find them and does all this shit. And he finds this picture from last year's harvest and it's a disaster. The harvest is terrible and there's Rowan Morrison in the middle of it all. So she was like the harvest queen the year the crops failed. So he's like, oh, they killed her because of that. That's what's going on. And so there's some things that people have said that he's like, but maybe she's not dead. Maybe they're going to kill her. And then he's like going around and he finds this book that's all about rituals. And they're like, sometimes you need a blood sacrifice. And he's like, they're going to kill her. They haven't killed her yet. They're just faking it out. And someone was trying to let me know. And I got to save this girl and blah, blah, blah. And it just goes into the like white savior mode where he's like, I'm going to save this girl. Does not end well for him. So he finds this book that's talking all about these rituals and things. And it talks about how during the May Day celebration, there are three figures. There's the man-woman who's got a sickle representing the harvest. And then there's a man who's in a horse costume who chases the girls. And that's, I don't know, fertility or some shit that's going on. But then there's the Fool, which is the Punch character. And of course, way back into medieval times, there's this idea of Punch and Judy, which is kind of this minstrel show, this puppet show that really developed and is part of that whole history. And they're tying it into this pagan tradition. And so they're saying then that Punch, this character, is the Fool, the like sacred fool, and he's king for a day. He decides he's going to leave and come back with reinforcements. So he goes to his little seaplane. That's right, he showed up in a seaplane.
You're just a virgin who can't drive.
Way harsh, Ty. So he goes out to the seaplane. The seaplane won't start. The radio doesn't work. It's 1973, so there's no cell phones. He just is, like, perplexed. So then he goes back, and then he just decides out of nowhere, I'm going to search house to house until I find this little girl. So he just starts going into people's houses and, like, searching around. And it's like they knew he was coming because they left, like, 2 puppets sitting looking like they're having sex. And then he walks into this woman's bathroom and she's naked, but just, like, sitting in the tub massaging her breasts. And she's like, oh, just bathing. And he's like, oh, sorry. And it's just like they're putting on this display for him. And he's like, I'm not going to stop until I find this girl. So then the barman, the guy who he rented the room from, is supposed to be the Punch character. He's in the costume. So he decides to, like, punch out that guy, and he puts on the Punch costume, and then he goes and he sees that the parade is happening. So he goes and gets in with the parade. And so he's trying to walk, and Lord Summerisle is the man-woman, so he's in this, like, long wig and this ugly dress with his face painted. And he's like, dance better! You have to dance better! Blah, blah, blah. And so they're going along, and it's this whole processional. And all of a sudden they go down and they get to the edge of the water. So they get to the beach and they are like, please, gods and goddesses, take this ale. And they open up these barrels of ale and pour it into the sea as like an offering. And then they walk a little further and he sees this girl tied at the like opening of this cave. And it's Rowan Morrison. So she's alive. She's looking scared, whatever. He has been like undercover as the barkeep because he's in this Punch costume, which includes a mask. And so all of a sudden, he just, like, runs up to this girl and, like, punches out the guy that's holding her, and he, like, unties her, and he's like, we have to get away. And she's like, we can go through the cave. So they run through the cave, and she's, like, leading him through or whatever. And they're chasing after him, and he's like, oh, we're going to get away. And he's all excited that, like, oh, we're going to get away. The white man saves the day again. Woohoo! Yay, Jesus! And so he's, like, going through the cave. He comes out of this hole. And all of a sudden, Lord Summerisle is there. He's had time to completely change his outfit and no longer has his face paint on, by the way. And all of a sudden, Rowan, like, runs up to her mom and is like, hey, Mom, how you been? The mom who pretended she didn't know her. And then you find out that it's all a trap. So they do need to have a blood sacrifice for the failed crop. But it's going to be that guy, Sergeant Howie. So he had to come there on his own volition. That's why everybody kept telling him, you should go. You're not going to like the May Day celebration. You shouldn't be here. But he chose to stay. So that's him, like, offering himself. And so they're like, we're going to sacrifice you. It's going to be great. And so they, like, grab him and they, like, strip off his shirt and they, like, paint him with this yellow paint and they put a linen robe over him. And then they, like, walk him up the hill and there's a big wicker man. So this is the Wicker Man that they've been talking about. Nobody's talked about it. So this is the Wicker Man that the title is all about. And so he sees it, and he sees that there's all kinds of, like, ducks and geese and, like, a little baby cow and a goat all in this, like, wicker structure. And there's a big open section in the middle, and he knows what this is about. So he's like, oh, shit. So he starts screaming for Jesus to pay attention to him. Like, hey, I've believed in you all this time. Maybe you could help me out right now. Things are not great. Things are not going well. So maybe you could help me. And nothing happens, of course. So they lead him up and they put him in this wicker man and they light it on fire and they sacrifice him while they're all dancing, wearing animal masks and doing this weird, like, swaying dance. I mean, it's not a good look. It's not going to work in the club, but it's fine. And so they go and they burn him up and that's the end. Ah, so good. So what's important here is when they get to the bluff and he sees the Wicker Man, they tell him, in order for the crops to return, we need the right kind of sacrifice. And he was the right kind of sacrifice because he's a representative of the law, he's a representative of patriarchal power, and he's a virgin. They make a big deal about him being a virgin, that he can't have had any sexy, sexy time. And so he's like, no matter what, you can't strip me of my belief in the life eternal. And they're like, that's okay, we didn't want to. We're going to give you a martyr's death. And that's what I love about this film. And that's what makes this film so good, is that it's really about challenging that sort of patriarchal power. So The Wicker Man is absolutely a bit of folk horror. It's part of that folk horror tradition. It's got the remote island, it's got the pagan traditions, all that sort of thing. But it also fits in really neatly with another kind of subgenre of horror, and that's horror of paranoia. Paranoia horror is where somebody in a film, the main character, knows that something is wrong. They just are like, something is not right here. Things are getting weird, and they get weirder and weirder, and everybody around them doesn't see it, or if they do see it and they're maybe in on it, they like gaslight them, and they're just like, no, what are you talking about? Everything is fine. So a recent example is Karen Kusama's The Invitation from 2015. That is a fabulous piece of paranoia horror. But the master of paranoia is probably Ira Levin. So Ira Levin wrote Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives. So with paranoia horror, a lot of times it's more personal stories. So if we think about Rosemary's Baby, it's really kind of this metaphor about a woman who's uncomfortable with her pregnancy. Because we just assume, especially at that time, that was like 1968 when that movie came out, women's roles really were to be wives and mothers. And of course, in the 60s, we have hippies and free love and people starting to question these assumed gender roles. And so Rosemary is kind of this character who is about exploring discomfort with pregnancy. Like, I think something strange is growing inside of me. Like, this thing is foreign to me. I don't understand it. I'm not connected to it. Because the idea is, once you get pregnant, it'll just be magical, and you'll have an instant bond, and all this kind of stuff. And it's challenging that. It's saying, no, like, what if I feel like my body is changing, and I don't know why? And so that's the story of Rosemary's Baby. And it turns out that she is actually giving birth to the Antichrist. So there's that. It's really about challenging those ideas about how women should feel during pregnancy. And of course, everybody gaslights her. And they're all in on it. And they're like, no, everything's fine. Drink this weird herbal potion that I'm going to give you. It'll be great. And then we have the Stepford Wives, which, if you're a writer and you were having trouble with how to edit and condense down your writing, you should read Ira Levin's The Stepford Wives. The movie version is great, but the book is perfection. I've taught it in a writing class before. It's so well done. It's like 85 pages. And every single detail that he works into that book, it's not heavy-handed of like, look at this. But every detail that he provides you is important later in the story. It's so good. And The Stepford Wives is really about a backlash against feminism. So it's about, now that women are changing the expectations around them, how do their husbands react? And in The Stepford Wives, they react by turning them into robots, so that they'll just be subservient little sex dolls. And what's interesting is that if you saw the remake of The Stepford Wives, that could probably be its own video. Then you know that the women in The Stepford Wives remake were very high-powered. One was like the CEO of a network, and they all have these big high-profile jobs, and they make their husbands feel small. In The Stepford Wives, they're just housewives who have like a side hustle or like dare to get a job. Like, it's not even that they're doing anything that wild or being activists or anything. The men are just threatened by the fact that the women aren't just being at home, being wives and mothers. So the main character, Joanna, does some photography, and she started to sell some of her photographs, so she's bringing in some money, which you'd think would be great. Her husband is threatened by that. And so that becomes this story about what happens when these power dynamics change. And that's why when we think about this film, The Wicker Man from 1973, in the context of paranoia, it's not the same sort of personal story. He represents power. He is a white man, he is a straight man, and he is a Christian, and he is going to this place where not only is everything contradicting everything that he believes and everything that he stands for, is that he's eventually powerless to stop it. And that becomes this interesting sort of allegory about challenging power of, we assume that men should be in power, that straight men, that white men should be in power. Why? Because we go to this place over here, and they're getting along just fine without it, and in fact, they have no problem destroying that and going on with their lives, and next year, it's probably going to be a great harvest. It's this really interesting way of presenting that paranoia horror, but rather than being a sort of marginalized character who's sort of on the outskirts already, It's somebody who's supposed to be in power. And that's why that place is so uncomfortable, because he feels like he shouldn't be there. He doesn't understand why these people don't just respect his authority and do what he wants and believe in Jesus the way that he says they should. And so it's really interesting to view it through that lens of paranoia horror. So in the end, it's a story about all of that straight white male power and how easy it is for it to become ineffective. It's all just an illusion. And in the end, it turns to ash. So in 2006, there's a remake. And so I was like, you know what? If I'm going to do this video talking about The Wicker Man, I should watch the remake and see, because it is sort of infamous, because this movie is already kind of weird. It's already kind of culty and kind of out there. How do you make weird shit weirder? Nicolas Cage. Now there's a lot going for this film. There is a great cast. So I hate Nicolas Cage. I know he's a very polarizing figure. People either love him or they hate him. But Ellen Burstyn is in this film. She's fabulous. Frances Conroy, we love her. Lily Sobieski is in this. James Franco even has a small part. I know he's kind of canceled. And actually, you'll probably like the way he turns out. But there's a lot of great people in this film. And it really kind of takes what started in this first movie and makes it strange. And it's much less clear in how it resolves in terms of whose side we're supposed to be on. By the way, I did not have a copy of this, so I had to pay $6 American dollars to rent this on Amazon. $6 to rent this film is highway robbery. It's campy, it's good fun. I'm glad that I watched it, but $6? Amazon. Go home, you're drunk. So the movie starts with Nicolas Cage, and he's a cop, but now he's like a motorcycle cop. It just shows him being an asshole, pulling people over, writing tickets, all this kind of stuff. And so all of a sudden he's driving behind this station wagon, and there's a kid in the station wagon who throws a doll out onto the road. And so he doesn't even stop to pick it up. He just like leans over while he's driving and like swoops up the doll and then pulls them over. And they pull over right next to this thing that says runaway route. So clearly there are semis there. And this is like near a lane where if they're out of control, they can turn onto this lane and it goes uphill so that they'll slowly slow down. So like if your brakes are out. So he goes up and he's like, I got your doll. And she's like, oh, sorry, we're moving. And the little girl is just like, I was bored. Like this girl is the bad seed. And so she's just a bitch and does not care. And it's this little blonde girl with little braids. And she's like, I was bored. And so he hands her the doll or whatever. And she just like chucks the doll out into the street again. He goes over to pull the doll out of the street. While he's in the street, a semi comes and smashes into this station wagon and it starts on fire. So he runs over to try and get them out. He can't get to the driver's door. He can't get to the passenger door. So he is like trying to break the window and the little girl sits up and again just doesn't look perturbed and it's just like, what, bitch? And so he's like trying to break out the back window and he's reaching for her and the car explodes and he's knocked backwards. And so they die. I'm saying that in air quotes. This movie is bananas. So he's at home recuperating, taking pills, and this female police officer stops by and like brings him his mail. And she's talking about how they never found the bodies. There were no bodies in the car. That's weird. There's no bodies. And then the car was not registered to anyone. It was just this car. There was no registration. So they don't know who these people are. They don't know what happened to them. All this kind of stuff. And he got like a commendation for trying to help or whatever. And so he's just talking to this cop and she brings his mail and there's this letter that doesn't have a stamp. And so it's just this like calligraphied letter. And it's from Willow, who is this woman who used to be his fiance. They had gotten engaged. And so Willow, in the first movie, was the name of Britt Ekland's character, the like sultry, slutty barmaid. So Willow is this woman that he had a relationship with. And she's like, I know I left you and I know I didn't say anything. I just ran out on you, but my daughter's missing. Could you maybe come to this remote island in Washington and help me find her? So, in the first movie, the guy at least is a police officer for Scotland. Like, he's part of the Scottish police force, and he goes to this island. Nicolas Cage is a cop in California, and just goes to Washington. And another character in the film at one point is like, why are you even here? This is Washington. You're a California cop. You have no power here. But he just goes. So he decides to go up there, and again, he gets a ride with this seaplane guy who, like, drops him off. He's like, they don't like strangers. But he takes him because he gives him money. So now he's greeted by these old women. So instead of the old men at the harbor from the first movie who, like, greet him when he first gets there, it's now these old women. And that's something that you start to notice, is that there aren't a lot of men hanging around. It's all women. So, like, the men from the harbor are now women. He goes to the bar. The barkeep is this large woman. She's kind of a sturdy woman called Sister Beach. And everybody has a name that's Sister something, and the something is always a plant or a tree or a flower. And they tell him, you should go see Sister Summersisle. I don't know why they added the S to Summerisle, but they did. She's the one who's in charge. You should go talk to her. So again, we're getting this refrain of, this is where the power is. You should go talk to her. And he's like, I'm a man. I can just wander around and do what I want. And they're like, you're from California, dude. And he's like, I don't care. I'm still going to walk around. And if I'm loud enough, you'll just let me do it. And they kind of do. So he just kind of wanders around and does his police investigation thing or whatever. And his last name is Malus. And I looked it up, and it's spelled M-A-L-U-S. So again, talking about these movies not having subtle symbolism. So his name is Malus, which is just a couple letters off from being Malleus, as in the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch manual from the Inquisition. When Catholic priests were running around trying to decide how to kill witches, they had this book that was like a treatise on witches called the Malleus Maleficarum, and his name is basically Malice, but he says Malus. So he goes into the bar, and he's talking to Sister Beach, and she's being weird, and she's like, you're not from here, why are you here? And then he drinks some ale, she gives him some mead, and she's like, it's this drink made with honey, and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, a bee is crawling on the bar, and he just, like, takes the mug and, like, crashes it down onto the bee, and she's like, why would you do a thing like that? And he's like, I'm allergic. And it's like, okay, so clearly we're dropping hints about bees. So he goes upstairs, and then he runs into Lily Sobieski's character. And he's like, did you unpack my bag? Something's missing. And what's missing is he has these motivational self-help tapes called It's Okay. And someone stole them. They're just missing. They never get mentioned again in the movie. So I don't know why they were even there. I don't know if they did get stolen. There's no indication that they went through his bags. They're just gone. And there's no reason for them to be there. It's so dumb. It makes no sense. So then he goes to sleep and he has this weird dream. And he's starting to maybe clue in. I don't know if he gets it. But the audience is clearly supposed to draw a comparison between the little girl who's missing, Willow's daughter, Rowan, and the girl in the car in the accident. So he had gotten a picture, and all the little kids on the island dress kind of the same. They wear like 2 braids, and they've got like a sweater that they wear. And so the girl in the car looks like Rowan, but it's not clear if she's the same. And you're supposed to sort of think that she's the same, but he doesn't seem to get that it's the same. It makes, again, no sense. There's all this kind of weird stuff. But he has this dream where he's like chasing Rowan, and then all of a sudden it turns into the accident. So they're trying to draw this connection. Spoiler alert, that connection is not going to matter. So then he wakes up and he sees this girl running outside in the red sweater that Rowan is wearing in the picture. And so he goes and chases her into the barn, goes up into the barn, into this upper level, and then the floor just falls out from under him and he like catches himself. But there's no threat underneath. It's just like he's falling through the floor, and then he climbs out and he's like, that was weird. I guess it doesn't matter that she's not here, and just goes back to bed. The next day, people start talking to him about this fertility ritual. How there's going to be this fertility ritual. You wouldn't like it. So again, we're getting this refrain from everybody of, you probably shouldn't be here for this big ritual. You wouldn't like it. You wouldn't fit in. Our ways are not your ways. Oh, and in the whole time, so then Sister Lily, I forget her name, I'm just going to call her Sister Lily. She comes up to him and she's like, where are you going when you leave? And he's like, home? And she's like, when you leave, will you take me with you? And he's like, we can talk about that later, but probably no. Like, just like, go away. So then we get a redo of the school scene. So he goes in, and one thing that you notice with the school scene, maybe it was worked in earlier, I don't know, but you really notice it with the school scene. There's a lot of twins. I don't know why. And they don't ever explain why. Just because twins are creepy, I guess? I have different thoughts about twins. So in this case, it's much more antagonistic, and he has even less reason to be there because he's not actually there as a cop, like on police business. And so Sister Rose is super antagonistic, and again, they're talking about penises and the fertility festival, and the same thing happens, where he sees an empty desk, and then he's like, show me your school record, and he just like pushes her out of the way and finds it, and there's Rowan's name in the ledger again. And so then they go outside, and they have the same discussion, life and death and cycles and all this kind of stuff, and so he's like, why aren't you telling me why she died? And she's like, you don't understand our ways, get out of here, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So then he's walking back, and he runs into this woman who is clearly Sister Rose's twin, the teacher. And her name is Sister Thorne. Yeah, I know. And he's like, didn't I just see you? Didn't I just talk to you? And she's like, no. As if he doesn't understand what twins are. At this point, he's seen multiple sets of twins. But for some reason, when he sees this woman, he's like, didn't I just meet you at the schoolhouse? And she's like, no. It's so ridiculous. So then he meets up with Willow at the cemetery. And in this case, there's a church structure there, but it's all falling down. So it's just ruins. It's not actually a building. But there's like a crypt that's locked. And he's like, there's a new lock on this. And Willow's like, I think they're going to hurt her. I think they're going to hurt her. And one thing, when he was talking to the teacher, he's asking about how did she die? How did she die? The teacher says, she'll burn to death. And he's like, what did you just say? And she's like, I said exactly what I meant to say. She burned to death. And so if you're paying attention, you'll notice that she switched it from she will burn to death to she did burn to death. So then Willow's there at the graveyard, and she's like, I think they're going to hurt her. I think it's going to be bad. And she's like, you have to save our daughter. And that's where you find out, if you didn't catch on before that, again, nothing in these movies is at all subtle, but if you didn't get it, she's like, this is your child, you knocked me up, welcome to the world. Like, this is your daughter. So clearly not a virgin. And since he was on a motorcycle, I guess he can drive. Gotta have a callback to that, Clueless. So then he sees the seaplane coming in. So he's gonna go radio the mainland because his cell phone is not working. He's got this janky flip phone. I feel like, when was this made? 2006? Oh yeah. So for 2006, I can maybe believe that he's got a flip phone, but it's pretty low tech. So he goes down to the dock, and the guy is nowhere to be found. So he's like hanging out, and he sits down and is just like waiting and waiting. And then there's like a sound from underneath the dock, and there's these panels where you can see through, but there's like a wire mesh. And he sees hair, and he sees that there's a body down there. So he dives underneath, and Rowan's body is like floating. But all of a sudden then he appears out of the water, and he's holding Rowan's body, and then he wakes up and freaks out. And then he like is sitting there and looking around, and then Rowan's body is there again, and he wakes up. So he wakes up twice. I don't know why we had to have this Inception bullshit in here, but he's like waking up and waking up. And so then nobody's there, so he finally is like, okay, I'm gonna leave. Later, he finds the seaplane guy's body on the beach. They just killed him and like cut out his eyes. Like, it's a whole thing. So then he goes to see the doctor. So Frances Conroy is the doctor, Dr. Moss. And so she's the stand-in for the chemist from the first movie. And so she's also the town photographer, and she's a doctor, and she just very conveniently has this large leather-bound book called Book of Ancient Rituals. And so it's just sitting there, and he's asking about the photo, because again, in the bar, Sister Beach's place, last year's harvest photo is missing. Except they don't harvest vegetables, they harvest honey. So the photo is missing, and she said, oh, somebody broke it today. So it's like, okay, aggressive. Goes to her, and he's like, do you have copies? She's like, well, I have the negative, I could look around, but you probably don't want to be here tomorrow, because we're having the fertility festival. Hey. So people are going to be fucking. Like, they keep trying to tell him, you're not going to like it. This is not for you. But he's, like, hanging around. And, of course, then he goes out, waits for her to leave, and then immediately breaks in and looks at the, like, Book of Ancient Rituals, which tells him, oh, we burn a little girl if the harvest is bad. And then he finds a copy of the picture that's got Rowan in the harvest, kind of like in the previous one. But there just happens to be a note in the folder with the photo that says, worst harvest in history. And I was like, who's your secretary? What filing system is this? It's clearly a setup for him. So he's like, oh my God, they're going to kill her. Because he sees in this book, like, we're going to burn a little girl. It'll be great. And then we'll get more honey. Oh. So after he reads about the ritual, he's like, I'm going to go see Sister Summersisle. It's time. So he's going up, and there's these men loading up this timber that's cut as if for a big bonfire. The one guy looks like he needs some help, so he helps him. He doesn't seem to be able to talk. And so then, like, the wood falls off the cart and he pushes him out of the way and he's like, hey, what's going on around here? And the guy just, like, puts his head down and walks away. So he's like, that's weird. And then he's, like, walking his bike. So he has this bike for some reason on this island where he doesn't live, but he has a bike. And so he's walking this bike, and he's not paying attention and hasn't realized that he's walked into this field filled with beehives and, like, runs the bike into a beehive. So he's so distracted, runs it into a beehive, and of course he's allergic. He doesn't have his little EpiPens with him. Not a great plan. And so all of a sudden the bees are stinging him, and he's running, and you get this overhead shot where you can see that they've actually, like, mowed a sort of hexagon beehive pattern into the grass around there and have put the hives out. And he gets stung and he passes out. So he wakes up in Sister Summerisle's house, and Frances Conroy is there, and she's like, I brought you back using the old ways. He goes to meet with Ellen Burstyn, who is Sister Summerisle. She's looking gorge. We love her. And so then they have this whole conversation about, your God is dead, and we worship all these things. And he's like, what's with all the men? And she's like, well, we love them for their purpose. Like, it's all about procreation. But it's clearly a witch colony. That's the thing with this movie, is they made it much more clearly about actual witches. Like, yeah, maybe we cut out their tongues and just fuck them and then make them do work. But we love them. It's great. It's fun. It's fantastic. And so he's like, I've got to figure this out. So he had gone around ransacking, and then he gets back to the bar. So Sister Beach is going to be the bear in the parade. He walks up to her, and it's this tense moment where you think they're going to argue and fight. And out of nowhere, he just cold cocks her. Just like, bam. She falls down. He takes the suit, and he's going to put it on. And all of a sudden, Lily Sobieski out of nowhere comes out of this side door, jumps on his back. He knocks her out, too. So he's just running around punching witches. Like, it's just a lot. And so he puts on this bear costume, and he goes and he gets in the parade, and the whole same sort of scene plays out. And then they go to a place where they see Rowan is there. So he runs up, punches another witch, and, like, takes Rowan, and they go running off through the forest. And all of a sudden, as they're running, Rowan starts running in front of him. Slow down. Like, wait for me. I'm trying to help you. Little girl who's my daughter that I've only met today. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing, honey? He kept calling her honey in a weird way. It just felt uncomfortable to me. And so he's going, and they show up, and all of the people are there. And that's where, like, she goes up and hugs her mother, and is like, did I do it right? Did I do good? And that's where they reveal that he's been brought there to be a sacrifice. And in this case, instead of needing a virgin, they need a man who's not part of the colony, but is connected to them by blood. So you find out that Willow was actually sent out to seduce him, get pregnant, so that she could have his child and lure him back here years later. Now, it's a little bit more graphic, although not as graphic as you would think. So then they grab him, and then the screen kind of goes black, and you hear them clearly, like, breaking his legs. And he's, like, screaming about Christ, Christ. So they're bringing back that whole thing that they did in the first movie. And you hear him call them, bitches, you bitches! And it's Nicolas Cage at his campy Nicolas Cage extreme. If you love that, you'll love this movie. If you don't love that, it gets to be a little much. And so then they drag him over, and they tie up his legs or whatever, and they hoist him up into the Wicker Man. And again, they're going to set it on fire, but this time they have Rowan set the fire. So it's this whole thing, and he's up in there, and eventually it burns down. The beginning of this video, I started with the whole, like, not the bees, not the bees. That's one of the most famous scenes from this movie that's not actually in this movie. So there's an alternate ending that was shot that was not included with the theatrical release, where they actually show him getting his legs broken. So the audio that you hear is part of that scene. Then they put this helmet on him and funnel bees down into it so that they sting him. And then Frances Conroy shows up with one of his EpiPens and is like, we'll do it your way this time. And then just, like, shoots him with the EpiPen. And then he's okay again. Okay, except that he's got broken knees and he's going to be put in a giant bonfire. It's the most campy, it's one of the most famous scenes from that. So while they're setting up this bonfire, everybody starts taking off their animal masks, and that's where you find out that the little girl and the mom from the car are there. So all these times that they've had these scenes where they've tried to connect Rowan and the little girl, they're not the same little girl, because the little girl is also there, and the mother is there, and the cop who brought him his mail is also one of the witches. It's this whole thing. But so then there's even an epilogue after that. And so it says 6 months later. So it opens up in this club, and James Franco and his friend are like looking around. They're like, we're going to get laid. Ah. And so they see these two women, and they go over, and it's Willow and Sister Lily. And they're like being a little flirty or whatever. And Willow's like, I'm going to go get drinks. And the friend is like, I'll go with you. And so then Lily is there with James Franco. And they're talking. And all of a sudden she's like, when you leave here, where are you going to go? I mean, it's a bar. Where do you think he's going to go? He's going to go home. And he's like, probably back to my apartment. And she's like, when you leave, can I go with you? And it echoes that thing from earlier. It's so cheesy and bad, but you can see that they're setting up for the whole thing to repeat. And really, with what's gone on with James Franco recently, I don't care if he ends up in a giant wicker man. So this film has a lot of the same elements, and they recreated a lot of the same things. But this one, instead of being about challenging patriarchy, it is about straight white men are fragile and need to be protected. So instead of just being a pagan cult, we have to make sure that these are actual bloodthirsty, magic-dealing witches. So it's a little bit more of a gray area because they killed the seaplane pilot and they like somehow disappeared out of the car accident. So they actually are witches and are doing all this stuff. Men are delicate creatures, and they need to be protected. So we can't have a real criticism of the patriarchy. So I think the remake, it's campy fun. It's interesting to watch. And if you like the original, it's interesting to see how they reinterpreted it and how they changed it. But the original is always going to be the best. The Wicker Man is a wonderful example of folk horror, and I think you should check it out. That is the video. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments. Are you a fan of The Wicker Man? Have you seen the original? Have you seen the remake? Which one did you like better? Is there something that you think I missed in my weird rambling rundown of these two films? Let me know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget you can give me a thumbs up, or if you hated my analysis, if you think I'm not very good at talking about witches, or if you're one of those straight white men who feels so offended by the original Wicker Man, then go ahead and give me a thumbs down. It's all engagement. The algorithm isn't a picky bitch, and neither am I. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell icon so that you'll be notified of all future uploads. I try to upload at least one video a week, and sometimes, I might even have a bonus video. Spooky. If you'd like to chat, banter, or commiserate between uploads, all of my social media will be linked down below, including a link to my website, The World of Champagne at JanessaJ.com. Thank you so much for watching. I love and appreciate all of my spooky fam, and until I see you again, bye. Oh, I forgot. I was gonna do... This cop is on fire, fire, fire. I don't know if I'll use that or not.
You actually had a note about that?
I did have it, yeah, so that I wouldn't forget, but then I was going too fast.